ELI5. How come all those atomic bomb tests were conducted during 60s in deserts in Nevada without any serious consequences to environment and humans? Yeah, there is a reason Nevada is a state with the highest percentage of land still owned by the government. There are large swaths of Nevada where people really are not supposed to go because they are government property and radioactive. There was a film that was accidentally filmed downwind from a test site, and it caused people who worked on the film to develop cancer at a much higher rate than normal movie staff, called The Conqueror. My grandfather was in the Marine Corps, stationed at Camp Pendleton, and was involved with the nuclear testing in some capacity. When he was discharged from the military, he worked at a steam plant back home. They had a Geiger counter, not sure the reasoning, that they were testing, and his body could set it off with the radiation he absorbed from being involved in it. He developed cancer in one of his kidneys, which later spread to his brain. There were others stationed with him that died of cancer as well. There was little to no government assistance, even so far as telling my grandfather that he had the wrong type of cancer. He butted away shortly after they caught the cancer in his brain. He was very intelligent, hardworking, and the most genuinely generous man I've known. There's not a day that goes by that I don't miss him. R.I.P. Gramps. I'm familiar with the wrong type of cancer argument. So sorry to hear. The people exposed to the plume of radiation from those tests were referred to as downwinders. My 6th grade math instructor died in her 40s due to the illnesses caused by that exposure. Grew up in a community downwind of a test site, Desert Southwest. Knew 3, including myself, at my high school of 1,200 students that were diagnosed with leukemia as teens in the last decade. These were all in the student population my senior year. Personally, I'm dubious as to whether this is directly a result of nuclear tests so many decades later. But I got my degree, somewhat ironically, in nuclear engineering. So I may be biased. Radiation science is in most ways a probability game. These are notoriously hard for humans to play. Edit. Let the record reflect. None were fatal. I lost a couple seasons of cross-country running, and JJ lost a season of baseball. But other than that, no casualties in that limited group. My grandfather took my mom and aunts and uncle to watch the tests. My mom has had and beat 3 types of cancer: lymph cancer, thyroid cancer, and most recently breast cancer. There were consequences. I'm sorry to hear that. Glad she beat the cancer. In addition to what others have said, it's also the nature of nuclear bombs. They have several phases in how they work. The initial explosion deals damage, but to a pretty small area, relatively speaking. There's an initial radiation burst with that, but this is also relatively short range. The reason is that most of the radiation that causes damage is attenuated over relatively short distances. Alpha radiation, helium nucleus of 2x protons plus 2x neutrons, very quickly grab 1 or 2 electrons from whatever they bud by, becoming stable, and thus not harmful radiation anymore. Helium is probably the most stable element in the universe. Alpha radiation isn't harmful to humans from outside exposure. The reason is, it can't even get through your dead skin layer without being neutralized. Even a thin layer of clothing will block it. Famously, alpha radiation is blocked by a piece of paper. The danger comes in if you touch something that contains or is emitting it. Then eat/drink something. Some of it can get on your fingers, then down your throat and into your stomach. And there's no dead skin layer/clothing there to protect your sensitive tissues. Likewise, beta radiation, electrons, are typically gobbled up quickly by any budding atom or molecule with a decent electronegativity, more penetrating than alpha. It can still be stopped by normal clothing. Same thing about ingestion applies here. This is why in radiation sites, they always say no eating, drinking, smoking, or dipping. So that leaves 2 other general types, neutrons and electromagnetic. Neutrons are electrically neutral. This means they can penetrate through things a great distance, but also b, they don't interact with things much. In order for a neutron to interact, it must more or less square on hit the nucleus of a budding atom. To put this in perspective, it'd be kind of like If you shot a probe or rocket into space in a random direction and asked will it ever directly hit a star at the center of a solar system somewhere? Yes, it can happen. But it's entirely probability / a crapshoot as to whether it does or it does not. It's entirely possible for a neutron to butt into one side of your body and out the other without doing anything at all. Or it could hit one molecule just right and cause a chain reaction, damaging several other key molecules in a DNA chain in one of your cells. Neutrons that do interact with the nucleus of an atom basically work in a ridiculously oversimplistic way of thinking about it, like Newton's cradle, the thing with the hanging marbles that hit each other on one end and bounce the one on the far end to swing out. The neutron becomes part of the nucleus and kicks a proton out. The proton is what goes on to crash into the next thing it hits, being positively charged. They are, of course, attracted to things where neutrons are not, and cause further reactions. Finally, we have electromagnetic radiation or photons. These come in energy from the low energy radio to microwave, infrared, the visible spectrum, red on the low end to violet on the high end, to ultraviolet, to X-ray, to the highest energy gamma rays. Electromagnetic radiation is weird in that molecules will only absorb specific energies / frequencies of light / photons, and they are specific to that molecule type. Others will bud through without any action whatsoever. This is known as quantization. They only accept specific quantities, and this creates absorption and emission lines, the specific frequencies they accept, which you can see in visual form. Further complicating things, if a molecule accepts a photon of a given energy, it may give off a photon of that same energy later. One of its electrons will jump to a higher energy when it absorbs the photon's energy, then jump back down later, releasing a photon with energy. But as there are many energy levels, an electron can absorb a high energy photon and then come back down from that high energy in steps, releasing several low energy photons as it does so. Energies that might not interact with the surroundings. For example, visible light can, but easily through globut, but a lot of infrared cannot. When your car is in the summer heat with the windows up, the visible light will, but through the globut to the inside. There it will be absorbed by the molecules of your chair, dashboard, etc. Some of this is emitted back out later as visible light, and again buds through the globut. But if the electron takes more than one step to come back down, it will emit several photons of lower energy infrared light on the way. These cannot butt through the globut, and so remain trapped inside of the car, causing the temperature to rise. Cracking windows means that some of the air molecules in the car that absorb that heat energy can then escape through the window, making the car less hot than it otherwise would be. So that's how that works. One last thing to note here is that if the photon absorbed by the molecule has high enough energy, it won't just push the electron to a higher energy shell, or bit, if you will. It will launch it out of the molecule entirely. At this point, you effectively have beta radiation, a free electron. But inside your body, as mentioned above, that's bad since there's no skin / clothing to keep it from the more sensitive tissues. To use our *logy above, it'd be like if you shot a rocket at another solar system and it hit one of the planets there hard enough to send it flying free of its solar system. Needless to say, this one is complicated. Like neutrons, these can butt through your body doing nothing at all, or they can go in and cause some damage. It is, again, a probability function of, will the photon, but near enough to an atom to interact, and b, is it of a specific energy that the atom will accept, or great enough to simply launch an electron out. If you exceed the binding energy of that electron entirely, then you aren't concerned about quantization anymore, since you simply remove it from the energy shell system entirely. Finally, it's how radiation works on cells. If something in a cell does interact with radiation, several things can happen. It can be some unimportant molecule that doesn't do anything. B, it can be something more important, but that the cell can repair. C, it can be something so important that the cell dies entirely. And for most of the cells in your body, you can deal with single cell deaths here and there. They actually happen all the time in normal life. D, it can be something important, but that your body can't repair. But that doesn't stop the cell from reproducing to continue the error forward to future generations of cells that derive from that initial parent cell. This is the bad one, as it leads to things like cancers. So, maybe a bit more in depth, but I tried to keep it from going too out of control there. The short version is, radiation is a complicated thing. It doesn't quite work like people think, and it's probability based. This means you could absorb a lot and nothing happen, or you could be exposed to a little and it kill you. People fear that unknown, but the probability of harm is higher with higher levels of exposure and b shorter times of exposure. So getting a lot of radiation in a short time is more likely to harm you than a steady amount of a little over a long time. And the vector of entry also matters, e.g. ingestion/eating vs external exposure to skin/clothes. And because it's a probability, did your missile launched into space hit a star or just travel endlessly through the void? There's no real way to prove harm. It's more looking at statistics. Seeing if there was a spike in something like cancer cases above the average of the surrounding year/time period, and then bottoming. That was probably caused by radiation. Initial blast wave equals damage, radiation wave equals possibility of cancers, closer equals worse, long-term concern equals contaminated surfaces, and ingestion, the initial blast, contrary to dramatic effect, is actually not the most harmful part of a nuclear explosion. Edit. I should note there's some more into this, for example, how the initial blast is followed by an inrush of air from outside due to the rapidly cooling hot air contracting, or the mechanics of the compression wave, etc. But I'm trying to keep this in ELI5 territory. Definitely an interesting topic, if you care to read more. I'm seeing a lot of people talking about the myriad consequences of these tests, but I haven't seen anyone mention one of the consequences that was shocking enough at the time to actually make the US and USSR decide, together, in the middle of the Cold War, to stop doing above ground tests, the baby teeth. There was a massive study where they had school kids and parents send in their baby teeth to be tested for radioactive material, since they're kind of like a time capsule. Teeth don't change really after they are made, and they do a good job showing what the human environment looked like at a moment in time. These researchers got tens of thousands of these teeth from St. Louis, in Missouri, around 1,500 miles away from Nevada, and put together a timeline that would show how much nuclear material exposure changed across multiple decades. Kids born in 1963 had 50 times the radioactive isotope strontium-90 in their teeth than kids born pre-1945. We might not know exactly how many deaths and how many incidences of cancer came from the nuclear tests, but that's because this was widespread enough that there's literally no control group. It had massive effects on the US population at large, and that's not even mentioning the horrible effects on the local indigenous population and the environmental disaster around Pacific Island tests as well. The red light atop the Fremont Hotel would be lit before the tests in Las Vegas. The next day the test would go off. Friends had a cattle ranch on the Utah/Nevada border downwind of the tests. Mother and two sons died of cancer. No one in their family ever died of cancer before the tests. We are called downwinders. Grew up in central Utah. Ate fresh veggies from the garden and drank raw milk from our own cow. I do not have thyroid cancer, but I have a nodule that I have to have checked every few years. My father was based in Nevada at that time, and he died at 49. My mother to this day believes it was because of the exposure he had is what caused his premature death. There are always consequences. Yep, my uncle and grandpa both died of brain cancer that we believe was caused by being downwinders. My uncle was 40. There were definitely consequences. There still was consequences and radiation for decades. Mind you, where they tested was in the middle of the desert, miles and miles away from any city. At least they waited until after the meal. My grandfather butted away from a rare cancer that was linked to downwinders phenomenon. In southern Utah, the radiation would be distributed all over southern and central Utah, contributing to an extraordinarily painful death for some Americans that just happened to live in the wrong place at the wrong time. Also, I had a professor at Southern Utah University in the biology department that moved to Cedar City to study the radiation's long-term effects on leeches specifically. He noted how easy it was to see that mutations had been caused by radiation from the testing. He was super excited and geeky about it, but the draw to study this brought him from the East Coast. There definitely has been serious consequences and effects on both humans and animals. Just got nowhere to look. I'm sure the government isn't keen on sharing this particular duck up. Grandpa and grandma used to tell me how they would go to the roof of the local high school and watch the mushroom clouds, unknowingly being dosed with high levels of dangerous radiation. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you want more videos, don't forget to like and subscribe. You are helping me a lot. Thanks again.